Protesters and critics say pulling the U.S. out of this agreement puts us at odds with the scientific facts on climate change. Supporters saying the move is in America's best interest.
Well, joining us now, we've got experts on both sides of the discussion. Nick Loris with the Heritage Rose Institute for Economic Policy Studies, and Melanie Nakagawa, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation, focusing on climate issues. Emily and Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we've got both sides, and we want to hear from each of you. One of the questions I asked Chris Wallace, just because we pull out of the climate accord, it does not mean that the efforts to stop climate change or protect energy and the environment are done, correct?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, if you look at the trajectory of our emissions because of things like fracking, we've driven down greenhouse gas emissions here in the United States. The issue with Paris was that it was a very costly, ineffective agreement because it would cost us power plants to close, drive up energy costs, that have huge ripple effects throughout the country for little to no climate benefit, even if all of these countries followed through with their commitments, which is a big if, because countries like China didn't have to peak their emissions until 2030. Other countries were really just business as usual in terms of increasing their CO2 emissions. So MIT calculated what the climate impact of following through with Paris, even though there's no repercussions if countries shirk on those commitments, found out it would only be 0.2 degrees Celsius by the turn of the century. So this is all cost, no benefit for Paris.
Melanie, a lot of people would look at this and say this is an abdication of our leadership on this issue. The global warming is real, climate change is real, and this is just sticking your head in the sand and not paying attention to the science. The United States is not the biggest polluter on this planet, but others are. What does it say to the rest of the planet when a country like the United States abdicates its leadership on this issue?
Well, let me just unpack a few arguments that were made. The first is that the Paris Agreement, us pulling out of the Paris Agreement, is a real problem. It is an abdication of U.S. leadership, and the reason why it is because we're ceding ground in terms of jobs, our economy, and our competitive advantage. The reason why being in the Paris Agreement was so resoundingly supported by companies, businesses, and investors is the fact that it is an agreement that levels the playing field. It gives U.S. businesses a competitive advantage, actually, rather than a disadvantage. The Paris Agreement made such a milestone of an agreement was, as Nick mentioned, the MIT study. The MIT study was actually misconstrued in the president's remarks. The way it was misconstrued was because it was just a start. The agreement says it is countries put forward commitments, but they can come back and revisit those commitments in regular increments, a stock taking, if you will. So this is a time for countries to put forward even more ambitious targets. So while the current targets don't get us to the 2-degree target goal, it actually allows a mechanism to allow us to go even further.
Nick talks about the economic costs of all of this. And, one of the things we keep hearing is about it's going to cost us jobs to stay in the Paris Agreement. However, the wave of the future is solar. It's renewable energy. Aren't we ceding these new and potentially very lucrative markets to countries like China that are going to go in there and suck up all this business as we stay on the sidelines with old kinds of energy?
Not one bit. Nothing from pulling out of Paris precludes us from being leaders in renewable energy technology, nuclear energy technology, fracking technologies. The reality is the market for energy is a very, very big market. We're talking about $6 trillion to light and heat your homes, to get our vehicles from point A to point B. So any technology that can capture just a sliver of that market is going to stand to be rewarded handsomely from the profit incentive that's already out there. We don't need a climate agreement. We don't need taxpayer-funded subsidies funneling our hardworking money to failed technologies, and if they're successful, they won't need our help.
Melanie, quickly, we have now officially pulled out of the agreement. In an ideal world, we're not going to be re-entering that. Not an ideal world. I'm saying, what is your ideal next step? Because I know you would be for staying in it, and we are no longer in it. Quickly, we've got about 30 seconds.
Great. The reason why we should stay in the agreement, and you said what the problems were, right?
Well, no, I'm saying we're not in it. So what's your ideal, what would you like to see the president do?
We need to re-engage. We also need to, I want to see what the president's plan is for invigorating this clean energy economy. The fact that we're out of the largest global agreement, the largest historic agreement out there, really questions whether or not we really truly are for advancing a clean energy future.
There were questions in the White House about what's that next step, what's that renegotiation. So we are waiting for that.
We're all waiting for that information.
Well, thank you very much. Melanie, not Emily, I'm sorry, and Nick.
Thanks.